Welcome to the TMRN, Time Monk Radio Network. I'm McLaren, and today's date is the 23rd of April, 2011. Joining us this evening from Niceville, Florida is Mr. Karl Denninger. Welcome to the WebBot Forum Roundtable.
Thank you.
The WebBot Forum administrator is Fox, and today he will be doing the recording and technical support of the show. Several forum members were kind enough to join us tonight. They include Mulder, Thor, Giuseppe, Mizar, Groundrod, and, of course, I am McLaren. For listeners, this interview, we will assume you have a fairly good understanding of Karl's work, as well as keeping up on the financial markets and economy by reading sites such as Mish's Global Economic Trend Analysis, Calculated Risk, Naked Capitalism, Zero Hedge, and, of course, the Market Ticker at www.market-ticker.org. This interview will be available on YouTube for free, on the WebBot Forum channel, and linked to webbotforum.com. Karl, are you ready to go, sir?
Most certainly. Let's have at it.
Terrific. Karl, before we get to the economics and financial questions, we'd like to ask you if you've heard of the WebBot project and Cliff High. If so, what are your thoughts on the ALTA and or the Shape of Things to Come reports, and the premise that all human beings are prescient and that future events are leaked out through the collective?
Well, I think most of us have had some kind of a deja vu or premonition kind of event in our life. So the premise that there is some kind of mass collectiveness, if you will, is not at all unreasonable. I'm somewhat of a skeptic as to whether or not it shows up in the writings of people ahead of time, to be honest, and I am aware of your work. There have been some spectacular hits, and then there have been some spectacular not quite so hits. But I guess that's the nature of such things. You wake up in the middle of the night with some kind of a dream that's going on, and if you write it down, something may happen and it connects to you later, but it may not be exactly in the form and the fashion that you saw. So I think there's something to it. I just don't know how to assign a probability to it.
It certainly is a difficult thing to do, and we're impressed that Cliff has been as on target as he has been. Thank you very much, Karl. To help listeners who may be unfamiliar with your views on economics and finance to understand your views of what's going on in these realms, it would be helpful if you would inform them of your definitions of certain terms. Among these are inflation, deflation, and so-called biflation. If you would please start with these.
Sure. Inflation is, if you look at it in the form that is used by the mainstream press, it is a generalized rise in the price level of all things across the economy. Deflation would be the opposite. And biflation would, of course, be the generalized rise of certain things and the decrease in prices of others. If you take a monetarist's view, a more pure economist's kind of view that you'll have with PhDs sitting around the table, inflation is first and always a monetary phenomenon. But I take some exception to the premise that many people have that it is simply the amount of currency or base money, if you will, that is in an economy. My position has always been that you must look at both money and credit in an aggregate, and the reason for that is if you pull your wallet out and you take a look at it right now, you probably have some dollar bills in there of various denominations, and then you likely also have a couple of credit cards. And your credit card spends exactly as does your money. So you have to look at the available credit that is available in the system as well as base money in order to determine from a monetarist's perspective whether or not there is inflation or deflation occurring.
Okay, thank you very much. Our first question this evening is going to come from Mulder. Mulder?
Hi, Karl. My question is why is it that you don't seem to believe that QE has the potential to be a hyperinflationary force?
Well, that primarily goes to what I was just discussing, which is that you have to look from a perspective in inflation or deflation. You have to add up the sum total of both money and available credit. And the important factor there is it's not just the credit that's outstanding. Right now that stands at about $53 trillion. you also have to look at the amount of available credit that people have to borrow with and whether or not that amount is going up or down. If you have a credit card in your wallet and it's maxed out, it is worth nothing. On the other hand, if you have $10,000 worth of available line on it, then it is just as if you had $10,000. You could spend it all right now at this instant. QE, as a hyperinflation trigger, if you will, simply is not of sufficient size in order to have that kind of impact. You're talking about, in the case of QE2, a $600 billion program. There are a number of coiled spring kind of problems with the QE2 program, but they are not of the classical type of hyperinflationary trigger that people would look for. And I think the error people make in that area is that they're looking at the monetary base simply as base money. They're not looking at the credit system, and I believe that that's a serious error, and it leads to bad conclusions.
Okay, so can you describe how quantitative easing differs from monetization, and if it does, how does it differ?
Doesn't differ at all. It's the difference between monetization of government debt. I mean, we have to differentiate between QE1 and QE2. QE1 was essentially the monetization of Fannie and Freddie paper for the most part. Only $300 billion of it was treasuries. The vast majority of it was agency debt. The QE2 program, on the other hand, is entirely treasuries. And so essentially what you have is the Federal Reserve holding down the cost of government deficit spending, which should be much more expensive in terms of the interest rate charged than it currently is. And as a result of their interference in the market, the federal government has been able to run a $1,700 billion deficit over the last 12 calendar months, leading up to the end of 2010. That's a crazy amount of money to be spending beyond what you take in. It's about 43 cents of every dollar that the government spends is being borrowed. And effectively what's happening is you're taking the $600 billion and adding it to the monetary base. The reason it's causing commodity ramps and not hyperinflation is because it's $600 billion and there's a $53 trillion credit base out there. And so in terms of the actual total impact, it's very small, but in terms of the psychological impact, it's huge.
Okay, you may have already answered this one, but I'll ask it anyway. Why is it that you don't think that the destruction of the dollar, which seems to be underway right now, would be hyperinflationary?
Well, the destruction of the dollar would be hyperinflationary. The hyperinflation, by definition, is the revulsion of a currency. And that is when people no longer are willing to hold and trade in a given currency and exit it en masse. That has certainly not happened at this particular point in time. It could happen in the future, but at the present, it's not what's going on. You're seeing a grand fleeing at the speculative level out of dollar-denominated instruments, but at the present time, the Treasury curve is actually quite well behaved. If we were undergoing hyperinflation, we would be having something more similar occurring to what's happened over in Greece with regards to the Treasury yields.
Okay, so what would have to happen for you to reverse your position on the deflation, hyperinflation debate?
I'd have to see a way for the system to take on a hyperinflationary amount of credit, or I would have to see a destruction of the credit system that leaves only base money available, and then for the Federal Reserve to attempt to replace the credit in the system with base money. I don't think there's any realistic possibility of either of those things happening. The collapse of the political and economic system in the United States is hyperinflation in a certain technical view, but it would be more a question of the destruction of the political system rather than the destruction of currency. I don't think the two could, one of them could happen without the other. In other words, I don't see the dollar disappearing, but the United States government in its present form surviving. That's just that's a ludicrous proposition under the under the present set of circumstances. So if we do have an event like that, it's my view that you've got much bigger problems on your hands than what classes of asset you hold.
Okay, thank you, Karl. I have kind of a strange question that just dawned on me. Ben Bernanke, at the beginning of the QE experiment, came on CBS 60 Minutes and admitted as much that they were going to be printing money. And then round two of QE came along, another 60 Minutes special brought him back again, and he denied that he was printing money. This was then caught by Jon Stewart on The Daily Show. How can Ben get away with this and CBS get away with this? Is it that the American people really don't understand what the concept of money is?
I think the American people are too busy watching American Idol and Dancing with the Stars. Ben Bernanke has told so many whoppers on Capitol Hill and hasn't been called on them there either. I mean, this is the man that said there was no housing bubble. He then said there was going to be no recession. I mean, I have a whole litany of predictions that were absolutely worthless over the last 4 years that I've made a lot of noise about. He himself has of course said he's really not printing money. On the other hand, you have the president of the Dallas Fed who said yes, they are. You've had other people that have said out loud in the Federal Reserve that yes, this is monetization, this is printing money. So why doesn't anybody call him on it? Where are the journalists? I mean, we had them when Nixon was diddling around in Watergate, but they all seem to have disappeared when the dress showed up with Monica Lewinsky. So I honestly don't know.
Okay. Yeah. No, I just scratch my head. Maybe that's my background, my understanding. But there's a lot more concern about Dancing with the Stars and American Idol than there certainly are about important things like what's going on with the American economy, budgets, all the rest of it. Let me take you back into a little bit of a, academic exercise, if I can, please. The great American monetary economist Milton Friedman is quoted as saying, quote, "Inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon," end quote. In this context, and in your opinion, is the Federal Reserve's policy of targeting or inducing a consumption from wealth effect by supporting asset prices creating bubbles or unsustainable valuations? Beyond a yes or no, if you could please provide us some greater clarity by comparing and contrasting short-term income and employment effects versus mid to long-term income and employment effects in the real economy, and then what other spillover effects might roll out into the so-called financial economy.
Well, Milton Friedman is absolutely correct. As I noted, my only argument with that position in the general sense is I think you have to include credit in the computation. What the Federal Reserve is clearly attempting to do, and Bernanke has admitted this, is that he likes the idea of the stock market going up. The problem with doing that sort of a thing and targeting asset prices is that you go from one bubble to another. What you're really doing is attempting to induce people to take on leverage, that is debt, to support these higher and higher prices. And this is what's happened over the last 30 years. If you take a look at the balance between gross domestic product, the actual output of goods and services in the United States, and the expansion of debt at a total systemic level from all sources, households, financial companies, businesses, state and local government, federal government, you find that by 2007, $1 out of every $3 that were spent in the economy in 2007 were borrowed newly, not produced. Well, that's a problem, and that's the reason we hit the wall. Is that if you lose your job, and you go home to your wife and you say, "Hey, honey, I was making $10,000 a month. Now I'm making, I got a job down at the corner.